Hi, Simon. Thank you so much for joining us on the Podball 100 today. This is Simon Thomas. He has been a broadcaster in my native land for most of the time. He is the first Brit that I am speaking to that is still based in the UK. And I'm very excited to speak to him because he brings about a whole section of podcasting that I find fascinating, and subconsciously was one of the reasons that I got into it in the first place. Simon, hi. Thanks for coming today.
No, thank you, James. Thanks for the introduction. No, it's nice to be with you, kind of.
Yeah, as close as we can get.
Yeah.
We'll start with pod, because I think that's a nice in for us to introduce you. Do you want to just explain to anyone that hasn't seen you what the pod is about and why Life Interrupted came into being in the first place?
So maybe I'll explain how it sort of came into being. So it was 3 and a bit years ago when my late wife died very suddenly of a rare form of blood cancer called acute myeloid leukemia. It was a very, very quick from diagnosis to her going, 3.5 days. So hugely traumatic. In amongst that is my boy, who was 8 at the time. So a life-changing event, just turned everything upside down and inside out. And, obviously a very painful few months then ensued after she went in the November of 2017. And out of all that came this idea, because I used to blog quite a bit. I was quite out there in terms of what grief felt like. I think when I look back at it, sometimes I wish I'd been maybe less out there, but I was very honest about what it was like. And so I used to write these blogs, and then I got approached to write a book. And so I wrote a book called Love Interrupted. And in the meantime, whilst I was writing that, I began having conversations with some of the guys at Global, because I had a friend of mine called Sam who used to run Classic FM, which is one of Global's radio stations. And he introduced me to these 2 guys called Chris Janes and Chris Bourne, who kind of head up the podcast division at Global. And we just had a few cups of coffee with them and my agent at the time, and we started talking about this series, this sort of word interrupted, about talking to men and women who'd gone through something significant in life. But at the time we were going to call it Love Interrupted, and it was going to be very much anchored in the book. But I think as time went on and we did the first pilot, I kind of felt, and actually my agent Luke felt, that it was limiting it if we kind of anchored it in the book, because then it's always going to be essentially anchored in bereavement, which is a huge area. But we wanted it to be broader than that, because of course our lives can be interrupted, ironically, as all of our lives have been interrupted in the last year because of COVID, can be interrupted in lots of different ways. So we felt, let's not limit the kind of people, the kind of stories we can feature by just anchoring it in the book. So we changed the title to Life Interrupted. And really the idea, James, was to speak to men and women, both known and unknown, who've gone through something that has essentially changed their life. It's interrupted their life. It's something that maybe has come out of the blue. It's something that was approaching for a while, whether it's, a partner being ill for a long time and eventually they die, or whatever their story might be. And we wanted it to be both a hard listen, but a hope-filled listen, so that you listen to it, and sometimes you're surprised by what the person you listen to has gone through, particularly when they're known, and we go, crikey, I didn't know that story about that person, and the story pulls you in. And yes, at times with some of the stories we've featured, it can be quite a traumatic listen at times. It's tough, and it confronts our own feelings on how we would deal with something similar. But we then wanted the podcast to end with a kind of, I would describe it, a resounding chime of hope at the end, so that you kind of stop listening and think, God, that was hard at times, but I feel a sense of warmth and hope now, because this person has come through something really big, and they found a way through, and they found a sense of purpose and fulfillment to life again. So that's essentially what we wanted it to be. And ironically, given where we're all at the moment with COVID-19, it's almost become that particular subject, that title, almost more relevant than ever, because as I said before, we've all, in different shapes and forms, had life interrupted over the last year.
Yeah, I mean, it's perhaps poignantly timed, right? Like,
not deliberately.
Of course not. Of course not. But I think your pod certainly came out at a time where people needed to hear battles of self, because I think that's what Life Interrupted is, right? You'll excuse me, I've not listened to all of them, but I did
James, how could you?
well, I'm catching up. Well, I say that, and I find myself saying this a lot, and I'm running out of my podcast hours in my day, to be completely honest with you, because
we'll let you off.
People, as I'm speaking to people, I'm finding that there's an unbelievable depth of fantastic, life-changing programming that is out there. And yours is another one. Look, I don't know if it's because a lot of the people you speak to are Brits or Brit orientated in that regard. So I have a bit more empathy with them. You know, when you're speaking to Fern Cotton, I can plot her career from growing up in the UK and be like, oh my God, that's what you're talking about, and so on. I'm going to interject at this point and say, for those that don't know, Simon's been a staple in you've done all of the UK broadcasting that makes you the ultimate British centre, doesn't it? You started at Blue Peter. Was that
yeah, I did. And for those watching and listening who have no idea what that is, if you go to Russia, the very phrase Blue Peter has a very different connotation.
Oh, does it?
But it does here in the UK. No, but for those who never heard of it, it's what we would describe in this country as an iconic children's program. It's been going for over 60 years. It's still going, not quite in the same way that it used to be, but that's because the broadcasting landscape for kids has changed massively now. But yeah, it's been a sort of institution of British TV for many years, and I was on that for 6 years, from 99 to 2005. So yeah, and then I went to work for Sky Sports for many years. So I've had a varied but incredibly privileged kind of broadcasting career. So I'm very fortunate, James, to have done what I've done.
I mean, I was going to say the other side of that, you went from the wholesome children's entertainment side of things into what many men in the UK and women, in fact, would consider the ultimate job, wouldn't you? I mean, you took a step on the way through to being the face of Sky Sports' football weekend, but didn't you? You did a Sky Sports News first?
I did, right? Yeah. I was on there for 5 years. It was kind of making my way up because I had the broadcasting skills. I didn't have to relearn how to do live TV. That was one of the great things about Blue Peter. It gave you a real breadth of experience in terms of broadcasting, from live shows to pre-recorded films to interviewing to trying your hand at loads of different things. So it's the kind of all-rounder. So I didn't have to learn that. But I knew that when I went into sport, being taken seriously was going to be a challenge. You know, I'm a kids presenter. You get pigeonholed. Here's one I made earlier, still gets quoted to me all these years later.
People handing you sheets of sticky back plastic.
Yeah, all that still comes. I mean, if I had a quid for every time I had one of those, I could have retired years ago. But you kind of got to recraft your career. You've got the essential tools, but you need to be taken seriously. So I spent many years on Sky Sports News, which I absolutely loved, but the aim was eventually to get to do the live sport, but that took a while. And then I went on to the Football League and did that for 3 or 4 years. And then towards the end of what turned out to be the end of my time at Sky, I got to do the Premier League gig. So yeah, if you're a football fan, then they look at that and go, that is the dream job. And you can't argue with them. Being paid to talk about football for a living is pretty much as good as it gets, if you like your football.
Are you a football fan?
Like, yeah, I'm a Norwich fan. Sorry for the pink thing. This is my.
That's right. It's very nice.
Bottle. This is her office. She's donated her office for an hour.
Very kind of her.
I am thirsty, but this is not my current. I've completely lost what the question was.
Football. You say you're a Norwich City fan. I can imagine there's a pressure for you to be on Sky Sports and be a bigger fan than you might be. I don't know. I'm a football fan for sure. I love football, but I definitely haven't got the depth of fan knowledge to be sitting on Sky Sports. Did you have to amplify it?
Yeah, and also your enthusiasm. You've got to have a massive love for the game, and it can become all consuming because there is, particularly now, because the broadcasters are having to show all of the games to fill the void left by the fact that fans can't go to the games anymore. There's so much football on every night. And I remember when I worked for Sky, is that you were kind of just overloaded with information the whole time. There's hundreds of articles on every single team every single week, and keeping across everything. at times is really difficult. And sometimes you just have to filter out, what do I need to know? What do I not need to know? Do I need to watch this game tonight, or do I need to spend time with the family? Probably ought to spend time with the family tonight and not watch that game. I can catch up on it on iPlayer or whatever tomorrow. So yeah, you've got, ultimately you need to have the passion and enthusiasm for the game, because you will be sat in a studio with pundits who live and breathe the game they once played, and now they live and breathe it as a pundit. And if you're not on the same page as them in terms of your enthusiasm for the sport, then you're going to sink very quickly, because they'll spot you. Fans will spot you. They'll say, this guy's a fraud, he doesn't really care about football, and your time will be short-lived.
Did you ever have any fanboy moments sitting in the Sky studio and just a colossus of English footballs walked in, and you're like, because you did Blue Peter, right? You will have met a whole swathe of celebrity talent across the board. But for me, for some reason, I've met many people and never had a problem. But footballers, they do something to me. Like my growing up footballers, right, which presumably are now the pundits in your regard. Was there anyone you ever had in the studio that you were like, wow, this is a big footballer sitting here next to me?
I remember one recently, James, because I've started doing some games for Amazon. And did some games over Christmas. My first one was the juicy tie of Crystal Palace against Newcastle United. And Alan Shearer was one of the guests. And of course, Alan does loads of TV now. He's a regular pundit on Match of the Day and turns up in other places as well. But I've never done a game with him because he wasn't a Sky
Because he was BBC, right?
Yeah. And I wouldn't say I went sort of all Googling, couldn't speak probably, but when you meet him for the first time, you think back to those. I mean, the game that first, because we were just having a normal chat in the Winnebago where you sit before you go out and do the game. And we're just chatting very normally, like we are now. And I'm sort of looking at him, and this sounds a bit weird, I understand, people are not massive on football, but I looked at that right leg and thought, and my mind went back to Euro 6 and the game against Holland, where Sheringham just lays it off him and he spanks it in. And Wembley went wild. London, the UK went, well, not all of the UK, but yes. The English part went mad. And you sort of think, gosh, but yet we're having a very normal conversation. But that's always what it's like. But there are times when you just sort of look at someone and you think, my goodness me, I cast my mind back to that moment when you score that unbelievable goal. And now I'm just sat in the studio. I was with Michael Owen the other week. I haven't worked with Michael either. And I know he's a pundit that, not everybody's a big fan of, but as a player, you cannot question how good he was. And again, sitting there chatting to him like we're chatting now, sat in the Winnebago before we go out to the ground, you think back to that game against Argentina in the World Cup, where he just rockets through that defence, dances one way or the other, and then just launches it to the top and think, that's him. So you do have those moments, but then it feels very normal, and it's just chatting about a game of football. But every now and again, your mind gets reminded these guys you're sat with have played at the very, very top.
The year you started Blue Peter, maybe the year after, 99, 2000, I went I'd been DJing for a long time. I did lots of rap parties and all that sort of stuff from 15 years old. So I was kind of comfortable in a green room environment, if you like.
Yes.
A buddy of mine took me up to Manchester to get a computer game signed by David Beckham.
Wow.
And I queued for 4 hours outside of HMV, and went in. And I was ready. I had my whole, I'm going to be the one that we have a chat with. It's going to be 5 minutes. There are going to be people pushing me away. And I get to the front of the line and I froze. I couldn't speak. I just couldn't see. It never happened to me before in my life. Yeah. And I said nothing. And he was like, what do you want me to put on the thing? And I just went,
I don't know.
Name. That was it. And then I was ushered off and I missed my opportunity. I was gutted.
No, just put David.
Yeah. So is it very different, Amazon to Sky, in terms of, because obviously the delivery is very different from my perspective. I get it differently and it looks and feels a little different. Is it different work?
Yeah,
or is the formula in
place? It is a different experience. The nuts and bolts of it are essentially the same. A game of football kicks off and you do your halftime analysis, you do your bit before and your bit afterwards. But yeah, there's a different feel to it. I think any new broadcaster who takes on the Premier League baton or live football will I think the mistakes that have been made in the past is that people think they need to reinvent the wheel. But ultimately, people are tuning in to watch the game. They're not tuning in to watch you. But you can, fiddle with things around the edges in terms of how it looks, the feel of it. I can't really put my finger on what's different with Amazon, but it does feel different. I think a lot of it, James, has got to do with the fact that for Sky and less so BT, because they haven't got quite as many games, but particularly for Sky, they have so many games that when you start a season, I remember, football league season, you come back in early August and you start the season. And by the way, I'm not complaining about this because it was a joy to do, but you'd sort of think, gosh, I've got probably between 85 and 90 live games between now and the end of May and the playoff final. That's a lot of games. And so there would be games where you're just like, you kind of just getting through it. You've had a long journey. You've got another game tomorrow somewhere else. You've got a long journey in the car. Again, not complaining. But it's a different feel when you've got multitude of games throughout the whole season, where Amazon, because of the package that they bought off the Premier League, it's a concentrated period over Christmas. So you do 6 or 7 games. They've got a few more now because, again, the broadcasters are having to mop up these extra live games. So it's not as all consuming. So there's that. It feels a little bit lighter in that I know that I haven't got another 80 games to go. I've got 6 or 7 and I'm going to really enjoy them. And this is not, going to be weeks and weeks of up and down the M1, the M6 and the M40. It's just a little short concentrated period. And so I think maybe also because of having had quite a period of time away from it, it's near on 3 years between my last game for Sky and my first game for Amazon, that it just felt lovely to be back doing something that felt so familiar, but actually you hadn't enjoyed doing for quite some time.
That seems a super easy segue into work mental health. You talk about that crazy Sky roster. When that sort of stuff arrives, is it? Do you sit there and do the playoff in your head where you're like, okay, well, I'm not going to be at home for this, and this. I'm going to miss this, and this. Is that what happens, or are you so focused at the time that, retrospectively, when you look back at it, do you do that equation where you're like, wow, that cost me this time? And because you say now it's lighter, you're back in, it's a bit easier.
Yeah, there would be times. Listen, I think the truth is, James, for anybody, the best job in the world will have its bad days. And sometimes you feel bad for even vocalizing that, because people will look and go, oh, hang on a minute, I'm working, in a factory doing intensive labor work every single day, and you're moaning about having to get in the car and drive to Old Trafford. What do you want about? Yeah, and of course they're right to say that, but it goes without saying that every job will have its bad days. I remember days driving out of Television Centre, in London, having done a Blue Peter show, the best job in the world for me, and anyone would look at it and go, how could you ever complain? But you still had days where you'd come out and go, oh, flipping hated today, and it didn't go very well. But that's okay. The pressure to feel like every day's got to be amazing is what drives you mad in the end. So I would just accept that there was so many more upsides to doing live football, that actually when you looked at it and go, oh, I'm not going to be around for that weekend, and I'm going to miss that event, and I have this lovely seven weeks off in the summer, but they're all while Ethan's at school, and then literally as soon as he breaks up, the season's cranking up again. I'm not going to be able to go on holiday and stuff like that. These are all small beer in terms of inconveniences. So I didn't tend to look too much and go, what you're missing out on. It was more like, right, what games have I got coming around the corner that I can really look forward to? Because there will be the ones you look at and go, okay, that's on paper not a classic tie, but then I can think, right, in a few weeks' time I've got, United, Liverpool, or whoever it might be, and that's something to really look forward to.
The whole thing that I took away from Life Interrupted in my crash listen is that it is very easy to forget when you are doing a job that people look at externally, publicly, as you lucky guy, that you forget that everyone else they're still going through stuff. Everyone's going through stuff all the time. And it was, you sit and listen to your roster of people you've spoken to thus far on Life Interrupted, and you sit there and think, honestly, some of them I'm sitting there thinking, what you got to complain about at the beginning? By the time you get to the end, you're like, oh, right, life, life. And it doesn't. You said about the Love Interrupted to Life Interrupted, and it not being necessarily about bereavement. That was another real, like, oh yeah, like trouble is, or personal strife is a
Mm.
matter of perspective, right? If
Of
you've
course it
never
is.
suffered
Yeah,
ever with anything and you stub your toe,
yeah,
that's the worst thing that's ever happened to you. And that
yeah.
is equally as bad as somebody who has lost 12 members of their family in a horrific coach crash on a metric of how bad things are in your life.
Yeah, and that's
um
a really dangerous game to play. And people have, I think, during this lockdown period, have played it a little bit because anything you're going through in life, however tough it is, you can always find X number of people who've got it far tougher. And what I always say to people who try and make that point is that whatever you're going through right now during this period, whether it's job insecurity or very sadly you've lost someone, or you're just finding it really, really tough, you can't do homeschooling anymore, you're finding relationships are under pressure, that struggle is unique to you
mm,
and it's totally real to you. And just because someone down the road or a friend of yours has gone through it far, far tougher and has actually maybe lost someone during lockdown, it doesn't invalidate what you're going through. Yeah, if you want to look at it very objectively, yeah, they've had it far worse. Okay, you haven't lost anybody, they have. It doesn't invalidate what you're feeling. And
mm,
I think in life, if we get into the kind of league table of pain, I used to find quite a bit after what happened to me, people would start telling me their story, but they always felt they needed to prefix it with, but it's, it's not as bad as, it's not as bad as what you went through. And I used to go, no, to you, this is your struggle.
mm,
This is your pain. This is the challenge you're trying to overcome right now. Don't invalidate it because you feel you need to compare it. That whole thing about comparison, the thief of joy. I
mm,
mean, it's not the joy in this area, but when we compare, it almost steals our right to feel like we're struggling or to feel pain. It doesn't. That's unique to you. And yeah, I don't think it's a really dangerous thing to get into when we start comparing ourselves to others when it comes to struggles, because we all have our own, as they say, the phrase go, we all have our own crosses to bear, but some are heavier than others, but you still got to carry it.
the I spoke at the very beginning of this about the therapy side of
Mm.
podcasting. Um, the whole reason I started listening to podcasts in the first place was because I tell this story far too often. For anyone that's watching me for the 5th time on this show or whatever it is, I'm really sorry. But a buddy of mine said to me a while ago, like, you choose what you listen to the whole time. I
Mm.
used to listen to talk radio all day, all night. I used to listen
Yeah,
to LBC and Talk Sport. That was basically doing a lot of driving. They were in my ears all the time. And my family are in various forms of media, and it never dawned on me quite so much that these stations are literally designed to be provocative, so
mm.
that people will phone in. You don't have to hold the viewpoint that the jock's talking about. They're just trying to get you to phone in, right?
Yeah.
So you hear the angriest, harshest opinions from everyone, because that's what incites people to phone in again on the back of those ones. And he said to me, look, that's what you're filling your head with the whole time. And if you're listening to however many hours a day of that sort of audio, well, that whole, you're a byproduct of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Well, for me, radio was becoming 1, maybe 2 of those people. And it
Yeah,
was intentionally engineered to be angry. Told me about podcasts and the fact you can listen to these long conversations about people you're actually interested in. And that was my in. And
mm.
without realizing it, my life changed on a sixpence. I literally made the decision one day I was going to turn off the radio and just start listening to people that were fascinating to me. I
Yeah,
fell into the, I think as most people did, Rogan trap was a
yeah,
lot of people's first journey into podcasting. But I listened to thousands of episodes. It replaced all my listening. And I found my whole demeanor became more relaxed, more thought
mm.
out, less angry all the time. Like, it was a real switch for me. Um, Sorry, that was an incredibly long segue into the therapeutic nature of podcasting.
Yeah.
Look, let's make sure that we've covered this properly for a second. When you lost Gemma 3 years ago,
Just over 3 years ago. Yeah.
in a super quick, you knew nothing beforehand, right? Like, that was, it just appeared.
No. Just that she wasn't right, and
Yeah.
then yeah, just went downhill rapidly. And then yeah, took her to hospital, to A&E, and then she got diagnosed the next day with acute myeloid leukemia, and then yeah, it was 3 days later. So
just your religious, says your Wikipedia page. I should you're
yeah, but
you're
Christian,
religious
yeah.
to some, but
Yeah, they've got that right. I used to
okay,
my Wikipedia page for ages. I had a brother called Peter, but I
but you
think
don't.
they must have muddled it up with Blue Peter. I've got two
Oh,
sets.
okay. I'll just cross Peter out off there.
Cross the Peter question out.
That at that point in your life, you must have started questioning everything, didn't you?
Yeah, you question absolutely everything, and anger and sense of injustice and everything is raging, you know. And I do think sometimes people have asked me the question, you know, when you go through something like that or go through something really big in life, does having a faith help or hinder you? And I said, in some ways it almost hinders you in the early stages, because if you do not believe in a God, then if you are wrestling with injustice and anger at the unfairness of life, if you have no belief in a deity, there are no questions to ask of that God. Whereas if you have a faith, you've got a lot of questions about that God and why this happened. So in many ways, it adds a further layer to everything else you're going through in terms of where you're searching for answers and stuff. And ultimately, it's just an inevitability. You will have to wrestle with that for a while. And then eventually you arrive, as I did, a place of peace where you accept that sadly for lots of people, you know, lots of people in life will have to deal with some really hard, tough events, but it's about what you do next that's the most important question, because they will change you, that's inescapable, but what's down to you ultimately is what you do with that event. And that's, you know, coming back to the podcast, that's essentially part of, you know, what it's about. It's about, okay, this happened, what did you do next? And that's the fascinating bit of the story for me. Yeah, I'm obviously interested in what happened, but I'm most interested in what happened next.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to me that the pod always ends with a, like, we're past it, but we're not. But you know,
Yeah.
what's going on live. Forget where we've got to. I really like that slant on it, because like you said at the beginning, it's some of it is a heavy hitting, you know, you hear stuff and you're like, whoa, okay. But it always finishes positively, even if you had a rough ride. And I get the impression that's kind of you as a guy, isn't it? In terms of how you live yourself. I mean, again, I'm only dealing on my public perception of what I've seen filter fed to me through my television and otherwise. But is that you as a person?
I think I'm someone who'll go after something, you know, if it, and that really got me where I was in my career. You know, the Blue Peter dream, that was 3.5 years of rejection and not getting anywhere after university, and eventually I got it. And you know, I felt really clearly, but it took a few months after what happened in 2017, that really either I accept life is never going to be as good again, or I, as I describe it, pursue life again. You know, I was in my mid 40s. I've got an 8-year-old boy at the time. You know, is this it? You know, is just gonna, you know, sort of wail around in a pit of feeling sorry for myself the rest of the days. And I just thought, I'm not. I don't want that for my life. I don't want that for him. And actually, I don't believe that because life ends for someone, that it has to end for everyone. And so I very much kind of turned my focus. It's not a callous kind of forgetting things. Just like, right, I want to pursue life again. And this cannot be it. This can't be life now. And actually, I wanted that as much for Ethan as I wanted it for me. And so, yeah, in many ways, that does reflect a little bit of who I am. In that, you know, when that moment comes, you go, right, broadcasting. That's what I want to do. I set the sights on it, and like, I'm going to get it. Somehow, I know it's going to be incredibly hard. I know the odds are stacked against me, but I'm going for it. And I think that's kind of been my sort of attitude to life. I'm kind of one of those all or nothing people, which does get you into a bit of bother every now and again, but it's also, it can be a massive positive, I think.
You, a buddy of mine runs a charity called Grief Encounter, who I think you've spoken to.
They work with my boy.
Oh, do they really? So
absolutely magnificent.
Yeah, I was going to say, if ever there was an opportunity to plug something one of my friends do, Richard is the
that's a good
CEO.
No,
And
Ethan has, it's all online these days, but
yeah,
he has a regular guy he meets up with online on a Wednesday called Colin, who is just awesome. Does lots of creative. One of the amazing things they do with the kids that they work with is they will try and allocate a counsellor who kind of fits their interests. So Ethan's very creative, loves drawing, writing, getting into his music. So he's quite a sort of he's a creative kid. So Colin's tends to focus on kids like that, so they're very creative sessions, as well as helping him talk through some of the things he's struggling with. That they are actually, all these child bereavement charities are magnificent what they do, and Grief Encounter have just been, they've been legends to Ethan. They've just been magnificent.
oh good, I'm pleased to hear that. That went better than I could have hoped.
Yeah, that would have been awkward. Oh, we used them, and
they've been terrible. My God. So when we set up the studios, January 2020, that was a great time to start a business for podcasts where people come in and chat. Although saying that, I did leave the event industry November 19, so that was, I guess, a good jump in that regard.
Yes.
The thing that a lot of people, having never been in the studio, come out and say is that they found the experience incredibly cathartic in a long form sense. Right, you do all your studio stuff, someone pops in on this morning, you get 6 minutes with them on the couch, you've got 5 questions from a producer that you have to ask before you even start. Not much of you goes into that, even though it's you delivering it, and not much of them comes out of it because it's structured away. When was your first like long form experience of chatting to people recorded, as in for output?
But this podcast.
It was.
Yeah, and that's what I love about it is, occasionally you'll have a guest where they're just really busy, so they will have literally, it'll be an hour, and the agent, well, in the days that we were recording it in Leicester Square at Global, we sort of outside the door going, but mainly you get a really good amount of time with them, and I love that, because having been so used to spending what it had been 12 and a half years on Sky Sports, only ever doing live telly, as you just hit the nail on the head. You've always got a count in your ear. Even go back to the football on Amazon, I'd forgotten that kind of how quickly a 5-minute chat will go, because I'm used to podcasts where I can explore something, and that's the freedom it gives you, because on Amazon I'm doing a game at the weekends, and if we get to the end of our 5 minutes on that chat, if we just go off on a tangent and explore it for another 5 minutes, then a whole load of stuff in the half an hour running order for the build-up will be gone, or you'll be late for an ad break. So there's always that pressure, right? Next question, right? 30 seconds left on chat. Podcast, I very rarely hear anything in my ear. My producer's called Chris. Very rarely, only once or twice when there's been, the need for them to be somewhere else, and say, you probably need to wind it up now. But that comes after about an hour. That never happens normally in live TV.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about doing it. It's that when someone says something unexpected, you've done your research, if they've got a book, you've read the book, so you kind of know the story, but they then say something, you think, God, well, I wasn't expecting that. And it gives you the freedom then to go and explore it. And really go off in a direction you weren't really expecting. Now, I love that freedom a podcast gives you, but also there's that intimacy, and I think that's what people enjoy about podcasts, isn't it? Is that you feel like you've been invited into the room to chat with these 2, 3, how many people are on whatever podcast you're listening to. You feel like the fly on the wall, the invisible dinner guest who's party to this really fascinating conversation. And I feel that with people who listen to mine, it's like you're in the room with the two of us, and we're chatting through some really tough stuff. But I love that intimacy that a podcast gives you, and the time for the guest you're with to understand that you're not trying to trick them, you're not trying to get a headline out of them, you're just interested in them and their story, and there's not an agenda. I'm not looking for let's see how many headlines, or at least mentions in the Daily Express we get tomorrow. That's not bothered about that at all. I just want to hear your story and see where it goes. Yeah,
it's completely different, isn't it? There's never really been that form of access before. Some would say you've got a Some would say. Sounds like a Top Gear intro. Most people won't know what that is. Great show. You should catch up. Some would say that you've had an easy path into podcasting, right? There's a lot of people that sit at home. They like. It should be noted, we're talking to you now on one of those mics, right? Like a Blue Yeti.
Oh,
But a lot of people will sit like you are now, and that is the beginning of their podcast journey for often years. Obviously, you're super well media exposed, and therefore you had presumably resources that you could have pulled upon from anywhere to have started the pod. What's it been like being with Global when they are clearly doing something different to what they'd normally been doing in radio and so on? Yeah, do they you might not be able to answer this, do they obviously acknowledge that podcasting is coming, and there's not much to do? I mean, personally, I would say this. I'm presenting a show called For the Podball 100, but I think it's where it's going. I can't see how current mediums survive in a digital age against the elective nature of podcasting, right? Like, how have you found that with Global? Have they got sort of one eye over their shoulder at podcasting, or are they in? Is it going?
They're massively in. And I work for it's like like with all their radio stations, whether it's Capital or Heart or Classic FM, LBC, whoever it might be. And we know that those who know Global know it's a huge pen for lots of very well known commercial radio stations. But in the same way that, say, LBC that you mentioned earlier is a key station within their portfolio of commercial radio stations, the podcast wing sits in there on an equal footing.
It
There's
does.
an awful lot of resources behind it, and they're great to work with because they're always coming up with ideas. They're always coming up with potential guests. Some of them are my guests, my suggestions, or Doreen, my other half, will go, have you thought about this? It's a kind of two-way conversation, and the great thing about them is that sometimes there is that kind of, I can see why they're pushing a guest my way, because you'll know this, James, that kind of cross-pollination. If you go on, if you get that person on your podcast, they'll probably go on, you can go on their podcast and they'll talk about your podcast on theirs, and that's good for numbers. I get all that. But sometimes I will step back and say, look, this is all, I can see why we're doing this. But at the heart of this podcast, we have to remain true to what it is all about. And that is about interrupted life, and powerful stories. It's not that I'm saying every story's got to be like, it's got to be huge, it's got to be a real like, ooh, wasn't expecting that. But there has to be an essence of what we started it off with to each guest. So there are some that I'll go, guys, I just, it's a really good name, but I don't think that's fits in with what we're trying to do. But I really, really, really love working for them, and it feels like that when they're, my producer Chris, he's doing endless podcasts. He's sat at home and I love it. He's got like this shed and he's got all his gear behind him. He's got the soldering iron just off to the just in case anything goes wrong. It's a proper sound shed at the end of his garden. But he's doing numerous podcasts every week. But when he homes in on yours, then he's totally focused on what you're doing. You don't think you're just one in many that he's done over the course of that week. That he is solely for that couple of hours or however long we've got, he's focused on what we're doing. So I really enjoy what they're doing, and it's it's right, it's here to stay, and this is on, for me, an equal footing with anything else that they're doing.
This presumably continues forever for you. I mean, there's no end of people. Lots of people I speak to in the podcast world. We've spoken to lots of comedians. We've started speaking to the true crime lot. I tell you what, you think you're podcast heavy? Go and listen to one of them, Laura Richards, who I spoke to a couple of weeks ago, who actually is a Brit but living in LA. She's like the true crime guru. Like everyone looks towards her, and I was 3 hours into her pod and I was just like, oh my god, I can't take any more of this. You talk about this acceptance from Global. Early on in podcasting, there was this anti-establishment feeling where the idea was podcasters were independent and it was very important. And actually, traditional media made, I think, a bit of a faux pas when they first jumped in, which was they tried to do the record label model. You know, they were like, we own you, we're going to make you famous, and you're going to produce stuff for us because that's how it works.
Yeah.
Presumably, it's, I mean, the very fact that you're able to refuse a guest tells me that it's different from a global perspective. Is it still you? It's all still you, and you get primary control over everything. You get control over what goes out, because I think a lot of people worry about moving to a label, and I spoke about this with some of the American guys who are with like Something Else and people like that, that they still feel completely, it is theirs. There is full control, and really they're facilitating and helping, in the sense of, you might not know this, but we do, so we'll show you how to do this bit. Is that what it's like?
Yeah, I feel that they give the podcast the platform, obviously, but they essentially facilitate my series that they've obviously given me the platform to do, which is great and amazing. But yeah, I feel editorially in control of what I'm doing. You know, as I said, Chris, my producer, very rarely ever says anything in my ear. Apart from, maybe you need to wind it up, mate, because, you know, the agent's outside the door wanting to get in. But that's it. And it's kind of, he just sort of says, right, we're recording, we're good to go, and away we go. And it's just me and whoever. I mean, obviously we're doing everything like this now, not with the video, just audio. But it was the same when we were doing it at Global in Leicester Square. It was like just sat opposite the guest, and we would just chat, and I would, you know, all the questions, all the thoughts I have, they're all mine. I put it all together, and that's the way I think it works best, because otherwise then it gets away from what it was originally going to be about. And it started as a conversation, and over time it kind of changed in terms of what we were trying to do, but it was always driven by, you know, what Simon, what do you want this to be? What ultimately is this about? And right, we like that, we're going to back it, we'll give it the resources and all this kind of thing, but this is your podcast. And I think that's the right kind of balance.
Has it cut out the company lines part? Because previously, like you said about when you met Alan Shearer, he'd always been a BBC presenter, you'd always been with Sky, so never the two shall meet, right? Like it's structured that way very intentionally. You're effectively, you're becoming property of the label that you're under. Presumably, again, you're not fighting that in podcasting. You're not go to global. Is this a global talent artist? Are we able to use them?
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, there's always going to be that. Like, if you're doing a podcast for the BBC, there'll be, oh, look, this will be really good for your series if we can get, you know, Peter Crouch on, who, you know, his podcast is doing so well. So, you know, this would be really beneficial for yours. I totally get all that, but I've always been left in a position where if I'm not totally comfortable with a guest, and I don't think editorially and in terms of what the podcast is ultimately about, this really fits, then I'm happy to go, look, I get that this will be quite good for numbers, but ultimately this isn't why I got into it. I just was really, really fascinated to talk to people, and hopefully in doing so, you know, even if it was only a handful of people ever listened to it, that it would be something that the people would find really, really helpful, particularly if they were going through, you know, life struggles themselves. And I think that's important that retains that. So, you know, I won't say whose, it's not for Global and them, but there'd be names that I've, you know, some people would go, I'd love those on my podcast, but I go, but if we're not careful, we end up with a podcast which is all about the names and less about the stories. And for me, it has to be the story first, the name second.
I mean, the names flow nicely with the stories in your case. You've got quite an extraordinary roster of people. Season 2, was it season 2 started January?
Yes.
Was that's the, so you've done your full first season after never doing podcasting.
First full season, and got one more to record this week, and then we'll have the full batch for the second season. And then we actually were chatting on one of those meetings online with the guys at Global and my agent the other day, and we just said, look, we should let's just get on and do series 3. So we'll at least start it, because, you know, like you got in touch with me, James, and, you know, we emailed each other last night. and here we are Monday morning, and we're doing it. It's so much easier because I'm not, I'm not going, well, at the moment, I'm not going out to the school run. I will be next week, thankfully. But so people are a lot freer. People have the time. So whilst we're all living in this way, which we don't want to do for much longer, please, not much longer, make the most of it. People are available, and actually quite a few people are looking for things to do to punctuate their week. So getting people on is a lot easier. And also because physically it's a lot easier in that we're not asking people to come to a studio in central London. We're just saying, have you got a half decent microphone, pair of headphones, decent laptop, plug it in, we'll be with you at 10 o'clock on Tuesday.
Do you think that changes? Because December 2019, if you were sitting there presenting a sports show and a sketchy 480p Zoom link was cut into the live feed of your 4K, super sport production, people would have recoiled in absolute horror. Yeah. Fast forward 12 months, it's basically the norm to be seeing cruddy Zoom calls in 4K is it's really
extraordinary. And we get used to it, don't we? We adjust, and our expectations come down a little bit. So now we're okay. I mean, listen, ideal world, we still don't want someone popping up on the one show with a slightly grainy screen and a pair of white earpods in. We don't, because it just doesn't look and sound as good. But we're
kind of over it.
We've got used to it, and I've got used. I have to say, when we first went into lockdown and they said, look, let's start recording the second series, I was really like, I don't think this is going to work as well, because I liked the fact that if you sat opposite someone, you can read their emotions through their facial expressions as much as through the words they're saying. Not as much, but you can certainly gain a lot from them. But it just took time to get used to that, and get used to. I mean, I did a film, I think it went out today, for BBC Morning Live, and I remember my days working for BBC for Blue Peter. The voiceover for a film, you'd go into a proper voiceover booth, and you'd have a producer next door, the sound engineer, and you'd be in there for like 20 minutes doing the lines 3 or 4 times. And last week on the Friday, the production team sent me through the script on email, sent me through an app you can use on your phone, and told me all the settings to put into the app. And then I recorded the voiceover of a film that went out today upstairs with a cardboard box, some cushions around it to give it a really good sound. And that went out this morning. I listened to it and thought, actually, that sounded pretty good. Not in terms of my performance, but actually audio-wise, it wasn't too bad. But a year ago, you're right. If you said you're going to record a voiceover for a BBC film that you've done in your bedroom, in a cardboard box with your phone, you'd have gone, shut up.
Yeah, don't be so ridiculous.
We got used to it now. We're doing it.
Does it also open up to you guests that otherwise would have been impossible for you to speak to? Like I spoke to, do you know who Mark Howard is?
Yeah.
Aussie sports journalist, like the Aussie sports journalist. Yeah. He's been the epicenter of sport in Australia for as long as sport's been going on, it feels. He was saying to me that for the first time, he's got an opportunity to look beyond Australia on his podcast, the Howie Games.
Yeah.
Because now it's okay. And his numero uno guest that he'd not got for 5 years, Kelly Slater, because he lives in Hawaii. All of a sudden, like when he started the pod, he said, he's my guest. Like when I get him, I've done it. And I spoke to him, and he just recorded with him. And he was like, it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't have done this. Do you think now that season 3, there's the possibility for you to reach a little further in terms of the guest people that you can get on?
I do, because of what we've just been talking about.
Yeah,
that people have got used to just doing stuff from home and realizing that it can still be really good from those places, and you don't need to travel in somewhere. And actually, if you live in a completely different, the episode I recorded last week was with an American author called Hope Endelman, who was living in LA. So we did it late afternoon here. She just got up in LA, and she talked to me for an hour and a half about her new book. And she was amazing. But I'm not saying she's a massive name, but again, that's like, well, listen, you're doing it at home. We don't need to travel in, and she's in LA, and we can just get the line up and boom.
She'd never have come to Leicester Square.
I don't think so. Not just for
Yeah.
a podcast,
Yeah.
no. But I think it's changed people's perceptions of how we work and how we record stuff. And I think people are now very comfortable just being sat at home and recording a podcast, which opens up so many more opportunities and, you know, more people come up. But I also have to recognize, James, that with this particular area, there are always going to be some who just don't want to talk about it. Like I really wanted to have Vinnie Jones on to his story, and it's not a definite no, but he kind of had his sort of media days around the book launch and everything recently, but that was it, and we couldn't fit it in with that. And now he's kind of, and I can totally understand this, he's just gone, I'm kind of done with talking about it now, so I'm not going to do any more. You know, and sometimes you just have to accept that people, they don't want to talk about it. I won't mention his name. There's someone else within broadcasting. He went through something a little bit similar to me. There's kids involved, and I think, given that we both work in a very similar area, he'd be fascinating. But he's just said to me, look, I'm not sure I ever really want to talk about this publicly, and that's fine. You know, not everybody wants to be out there with them, so you have to accept that there are some, because it's the nature of the podcast and what we're talking about, that, you know, just don't want to share their story. And I will always respect someone who feels like that. I won't ever put extra pressure on and say, oh, come on, it'd be great for you to come on. No, if you're not comfortable talking about it, you want to keep this private, that's fine.
When's Ian Wright on?
he would be lively, wouldn't he? Gosh,
he'd be a great guest.
Shearer to come on.
You should. Oh yeah, he'd be a great guest as well.
Ian I think they offered us him, but it was literally we can only have 15 minutes with him, and I just
it's not long enough for the pod.
Not long enough. We'll get into something really amazing, and then it's like bye bye.
Do you never feel that there's a challenge there where you're like, I reckon if I got Tyson talking, I reckon 15 minutes would come, and he'd be like, go away, I'm carrying on.
Yeah, no, that's really funny you said that, because I felt exactly like that when they offered him. I thought, I can get him talking long, and the guys I was talking to said, no, seriously, mate, it will be 15 minutes. That's it. He's got all these others booked in. You know, it's like those junket interviews, isn't it, for a new movie? I've done a couple of them many, many years ago. When your time's done, your time's done.
Wait, what movie were you in?
I think the last one I did was Polar Express in central London.
Oh, did you? Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
It was amazing. So yeah, just walked in there. I think, where was it? It was the Hilton Hotel in Knightsbridge, and I think Notting Hill had been out by that point. So I remember the scene with Hugh Grant going in and saying, "I'm from Horse and Hound," when he thinks he's got a date, and actually he's a press junket with Julia Roberts' character. No, but and I remember getting, what was it, 10 minutes with Tom Hanks, because you initially walk in there and go, Tom Hanks.
Yeah.
And then we didn't, it was a kids film, that's why we did it. But, you know, there's the seasoned film critics, they're used to walking in, there's Tom Hanks, there's Tom Cruise, you know, let's get on with it. But then with me, I'd hardly done anything. You walk in and go, but then you've got someone just going,
come on. Yeah. You're on the clock.
You know, if you get a small chat and a bit, oh, Tom, it's lovely to meet you. That's your minute gone, and you've got 9 left. So, I think for a podcast like this, it's very, very tempting to go, but we could get something, and you know, maybe they want to talk longer, but actually, the reality is that they're just not, and their people are not going to let them. So reluctantly say no. That's the
go get it nature of you, though, isn't it? That's
I reckon I can get more out of Tyson than anyone, but it won't be him. It'll be his people who'll go. Well, not literally. You wouldn't.
I was going to say, how often does Tyson Fury get pulled out of a room?
That's never going to work. But you just know it's not going to be longer than 15. So sadly, I went. I just don't think we should do it.
Do you listen to podcasts? Have you got time? What do you listen to?
I listen to more. I mean, I was a big fan of. I've been a huge fan of James O'Brien for many years, not simply because we used to both work in Selfridges at the same time when we were trying to get our media breaks, but I love his full disclosure, because I listen to him on LBC quite a bit, and I so agree with you about, if you listen to the same things all the time, how it kind of can change our perception.
My cousin is a presenter on LBC. I should put it out there. Yeah, Daniel Barnett. He used to do the League Hour, and he's just done a thing. So I don't have an axe to grind at all with them. I'm
No,
always
I love LBC, but I'm a bit. It's so, and I can understand why they do it. You know, it's so COVID central now. It's all
yeah,
mostly all they ever talk about. Whereas James he does mix it up a bit.
yeah, he did.
I'm a big admirer of his, but I love Full Disclosure. I've always been a huge fan of. But my partner Dorina always is sending me podcasts. So when I did a couple of long journeys week before last, I think it's called Blended Families, but there's a really interesting podcast I listened to about that. That's what I love about podcasts, because I'm not someone who would just devour the same series, but sometimes you can just go and find an area of life. So, you know, one of the things that has been a challenge for us as we've kind of grown to know each other and fall in love is that, you know, for Dorina, she's taking on my boy, and a boy who's lost his mum, and there's lots of complexities that come with that. And so finding a podcast that talks about this area, which is a huge area for like step parents around the world, but around this country, who through a second marriage, it might be, then we got divorced, whatever, they take on someone else's kids. The idea of how you go about blending families and challenges that entails, you can find a podcast series on that. Now that's incredible, because you won't hear this. I think it was touched on in the Rio Ferdinand and Kate documentary, not the first one being Mum and Dad, but the one that featured both of them. And Kate's honesty about the challenges of taking on his kids, I mean, now they've got their own kid as well, was fascinating. But that's one program. Here's a whole series on this one area. And I listened to a couple on the way to Liverpool the other week to do some filming, and it was really good because it gives me a greater understanding of what this is like for Dorina. You know, there's lots of, you know, I'll dip into sports podcasts. I tend to use a lot of the ones where it will be a kind of highlights program of a sporting program and stuff. But I'm getting into them more and more. But it's a little bit like with the football. Once you start doing one, you become so immersed in the world of podcasting that you think, when do I think if I was back traveling again in the way that I used to be, I'd be listening to much more again. But when you've got kids and lots to do, there's not loads of time for it. But Dorina's always got a podcast on.
What does Dorina do?
She's a lawyer.
Oh, is she? Oh,
yeah.
That's a very, very straight-edged foil to your media career.
Yeah, no, she's great. She'll always check a contract for me.
The Ian Wright podcast is about extraordinary people. He's a good guy. It's a good listen, and I think you'd see a lot of correlation between some of the stories and the sort of things that you would.
The thing about podcasts is it's like being a hungry man in a sweet shop. You just don't know where to look. You know, there's so much choice out there. And people are just constantly recommending them as well, aren't they? That you just go, where do I even start? Because there's just so many good ones out there, which is fantastic. But it's also a little bit, the amount of recommendations you get, you just go, I just don't know where to go next.
Yeah. Let me give you some stats, some podboard stats about you. Here you go. Season 2 starting on the 11th of January. Every episode so far has entered the UK Podboard 100 charts on release date. That isn't the self-help charts or whatever you might sort of drive your category down into. That is, of all of the UK podcasts, every episode that's been released thus far has made it into the top 100. They've all stayed for it's a daily chart as well.
Yeah.
Which is a big difference from normally their weekly charts. But every single episode has stayed on that top 100 for at least 4 days after release. So that's a big, that's tough. What was, if you had to pick it out, what do you think your biggest episode was on the podboard in terms of social interactions that followed?
Of this series?
Yeah.
I would imagine it was Philip Schofield.
It was Philip Schofield.
Yes. That got a lot of pickup in the press, which is, I think that's I think Fern's did a little bit, but Fern's, what she was saying might have been new, but the subject matter wasn't. People knew about the various things she struggled with in terms of her mental health. Whereas I think with Philip, people are very interested to hear what more there is to come from what was a very public story over a year ago. So I was surprised how much it got picked up in the press, and that that doesn't surprise me, actually, that it was, a number of people. I think Dan Walker's one would be up there as well. The one about his book, that seemed to get a lot of traction.
In fact, Dan Walker's on the 8th of February was the most discussed on social media, with more social media interactions than any other episode.
I mean, we had some lovely stories back by that. And there was one, this is where you hear a story like this and go, this makes doing it worth it. This really does. And Dan sent the story to me. I think someone had emailed him or direct messaged him on social media and said he'd been listening to the podcasts between the two of us, and it's all revolves around Dan's new book. And Dan was making the point, I think he was talking about the Gary Speed story. That's one of the things we focused in on, how Dan had him on Football Focus on the Saturday. And by the Sunday morning, Dan's hearing the news that Gary's tragically taken his life. And we talked so much about that and about his amazing two sons and how they responded, but also the impact it had on Dan. It wasn't, a family member, but it was someone Dan knew well and had grown to love and respect as a friend, and the sort of profound impact it had on him. And he said one of the things it changed in him was that never wanting to leave a conversation on a bad note, in the most dramatic way possible. He'd have never known on that Saturday, as he said goodbye to him in the BBC Sports office in Manchester, that he would never, ever see him again. And now they did leave it on a good moment, and we're talking about playing golf in a few weeks' time. But he always felt this need to end the conversation on a good note. And this guy had been listening, and I think he walked by this guy in the park just after he listened to Dan talking about that, and saw this poor old guy struggling with his shopping, and he sat on a bench looking down and out, couldn't move anymore. And the guy felt just really sort of inspired to go and help. And he walked this guy's shopping home for him. He was an older guy. He just felt challenged by what Dan had been talking about, what we've been talking about. I thought, God, that makes everything worth it. When you hear lovely little stories like that about how it's changed someone's day and it's changed someone else's day, you think this is a good thing we're doing.
I'm going to use this word loosely. In fact, I'm even going to put it in actual physical parenthesis. When you speak to fans, I'm doing it like this, you'll see why. How does it differ from being on TV? Sports fans certainly, kids certainly with Blue Peter, versus the podcast. Do you interact differently with people? Do you feel like it's? I'm setting you up. I'm not going to say it. How do you feel the fan difference goes?
Well, it's the level of conversation is a different flavour. When you do a football game, obviously you won't always get nice things, but I had a lot of comments when I went back to the football in November with Amazon saying just so lovely to see you back, welcome back, great to see you back on the box, great to see you doing the football again. It's all lovely, but it's fairly superficial. When you get comments from people who are listening to the podcast, it's a different level of comments, because some people just do say, oh, great podcast, really enjoyed it this week, but often it's because there's something within that particular episode that really struck home for them. It may be it's a similar story to something they went through, so you tend to get slightly longer comments and more engaging in terms of just like, great to see you back. It's kind of like, oh, I found that really inspiring, or that this person has really challenged me to rethink this. And it's a different level. And I think you have to be careful, James, in that some of us feel bad for not doing it. I should engage with these people, but actually you can't spend your life engaging with people. And I do think when you tell stories like this and you are vulnerable enough as a presenter maybe to reflect on a little bit of your story in amongst what that person is telling you, that it kind of gives people this permission to offload a bit of their life and their stories onto you. And if you spend your time absorbing those stories, it can impact on you, but also you can end up spending an awful lot of time replying to messages. And I feel that sometimes it's a bit rude not to, but actually I've got a family to
a life,
spend time with and look after, and and a life to live. I can't spend my whole life online replying to people.
Is there a lot of noise? Like the internet is a savage place, right? Do you read any of it? or do you just let it? I mean, obviously you've just said you know you get some lovely messages that come in, but equally there must be people, I don't know, you're kind of a very, very nice guy. I can't imagine there's many people that are like, that's that evil Simon Thomas.
No, I mean, there's an occasional idiot, but you'll just get them anywhere. I don't find it now, but I used to find, I had a rule on the football when I was at Sky, and I think this was particularly went to the Premier League. You know, one thing you notice straight away from going from the Football League to the Premier League is just the level of scrutiny was cranked up a lot more people watching it. It's no disrespect to the Football League, it's the Premier League. It's, you know, the most watched league in the world. I would have a 24-hour rule in terms of social media, because listen, if you're in the public eye and doing a job on, you know, what you're doing, if you appear in front of a camera or talk into a microphone or write articles for a newspaper or a magazine, you're putting yourself out there and you're inviting people to form an opinion on you. And that opinion might be right or wrong, but it's only based on what they see or what they hear or what they read. And there will always, however good a broadcaster you are, however nice a person you are, there will always be people who don't like you. And there's nothing you can do about that. You just have to accept that while for one kid, all those years ago, I was their favourite Blue Peter presenter ever, there will be another kid for whom I was the worst Blue Peter presenter ever.
You were the reason they stopped watching.
Yeah, I am the reason why they went to ITV or started watching. And you just have to accept that. That's life. And if you choose to do this job, that's what will happen. So yeah, on the football, I just knew, particularly with football, it's so tribal. You know, you're always getting accused of being biased. Every fan, when they're listening to the pundits talking about their team, will think there's an agenda against their team, or they don't get enough airtime, or whatever it might be. You cannot win, particularly when it comes to football. So I would have a rule after any game I did, is leave social media alone for 24 hours. Don't go on it, because, do you know, there were some days you just come off air and you think, I've had a really good day. I've enjoyed the game. It was a really good game. Everything's gone right in terms of the broadcast. I've asked pretty much the right questions. The pundits have been brilliant. I've not messed up my piece of the camera because you have to memorize it. There's no auto cue. It's all gone well. So why ruin your day by seeing what some pillock in Barnsley has decided to write to you? I'm not picking out Barnsley for any particular reason, but just someone sat there on their sofa just gone, don't like him, wallop, and they hit you with something. That's enough to ruin your day, or at least mine, because you start thinking about it. Oh, why has he said that? Well, he's just an idiot, you know. But I used to leave it alone and actually come back to 24 hours later, and most of the time it was never as bad as you thought. But I just thought, I don't need to read what everyone said. But then you work with some pundits and they love it, and they're interacting as you do in the game. Like, you know, they want to know what, you know, they said about Newcastle and Mike Ashley. I remember Shearer doing it the first game. He's looking at Twitter going, oh, that's gone down well. That's not gone down so well. That's the way he's fine with that. Whereas I'm like, I don't need this to ruin my day, so I park it for a bit.
The Life Interrupted it sounds amazing. Like it's silkily produced by your man in your shed. Sorry, drop his name again because I've forgotten it. Chris. Everything sounds beautiful. You know, it's very clean. You almost, there's no breaths. You can't hear any of the sort of obtuse bits. You must go through it with a fine tooth comb when you're finished. How much of your live TV experience has helped you? So you take a show, the Fern show was what, an hour and 15 minutes or something?
Yeah, yeah.
How much did you record with Fern versus how much went out?
All of it went out. There wasn't
it did.
Any. Yeah. Everything went out. There's only been probably one episode with one person where I just, the end of it, I said, look, I don't want that to go in.
Now I have to find it. I'm going to look for it. Don't tell me. I'm going to find it.
Okay, look for it. I don't think you'll find it. But the only reason is that he kind of turned it back on me a little bit, and it turned into an interview with me. Yeah. And I said to Chris at the end, it's not that I'm uncomfortable talking about it, but that's not, the podcast isn't about me. You know, it's not. It's like I can share little bits, but ultimately I'm interested in him, and he's now interviewing me. This is just weird. So I said, you know, and also just what he was asking me, I just thought, I don't know why this is just a bit surreal. So I said, cut that out. But all the others, everything that we talk about goes in, you know, and that's the joy of it. There's not clunky edits. There's not kind of, we've got to get it down to 59 minutes and 59 seconds. it just goes in, and if it's an hour, it's an hour. If it's 50 minutes, it's 50 minutes. If it's an hour and a half, it's an hour and a half. You know, and that's why I love it. You're not constrained by a slot.
Let me ask you a couple of podcasty questions. You do some mid-roll reads in your pod for adverts in the middle of it. Are they from someone like Midroll, or is that global centrally creating your ad pool for you? Because I fell for one. You know, the whole idea of these insertion reads is that you, it's not the guy from the company telling you, it's you telling you. It's a very different thing. You do a Lego read, right?
Yes, find your joyful focus.
Yes, and I'm walking around. I was listening to one of the pods, and I'd obviously got distracted for a brief minute doing something. And by the time I came back in my head, because you were in my ears the whole time, you were talking about Lego, and it wasn't until you very got to the end that I was like, oh, that was an ad. I can't believe I fell for it. That's amazing. Do you? I mean, you might not be able to say. By all means, X me at this point if you want to. Did they approach you as a good outlet for that? Did they send you and Ethan a ton of Lego to actually play with, or was it a read of something you did?
No, it's a combination of the two. So they you know, like a lot of companies will look at a podcast series and will go, right, that what this person is doing kind of fits in with our kind of company and our products and all those kind of things. And Lego have sort of got these adult sets now, and they're trying to sort of get into the whole sort of well-being area as well. And so they looked at the podcast, because we will talk about, you know, mental health issues and all those kind of things, and felt that kind of fitted in. Now, what they wanted is it to be an authentic advert. So what they did is they sent me, you know, initially said, you know, are you interested? I said, yeah, because Ethan loves Lego. And they sent me, they got me to choose one adult set. So I chose these, the Beatles adult set, where you make one head of the Beatles. So I made John Lennon, and it's about 4 hours. And so the whole idea is that when I came to read the advert, so what they do is they send you through kind of like a brief on the kind of key messages they wanted it, but they wanted it to be my words. So that's why they said, we don't want to do the advert unless Simon's actually had a go at it, because we want it to be authentic based on the fact he's actually made it and how it made him feel. So we made it, and then the next week I kind of sort of took their message, wrote it, sent it back to my producer, said, what do you think? And then we recorded it. So authenticity was right at the heart of what they wanted it to be, and not just me going, oh, isn't it great? And I've no idea, because I've not spent any time making one of their products.
Mission accomplished. I mean, I fell for it.
Yeah.
Good and proper.
Up, actually, still in the garage.
It's a really nice part of podcasting, I think, is that the commercialization side of it is really only happening with brands that are relevant to the. You'd never get you're not going to get Tide, American brand, odd way to go. You're not going to get Persil advertising on your pod. But whereas if you're on the radio or on the TV, there's every chance that you close out an epic game of football and the ad cuts to, you know, someone cleaning a shirt in the thing, and you're like, well, that's got nothing to do with me. Everything remains on brand in podcasting, or ideally so. So season 3 is about to kick off, or the recording of which you've got one more of season 2, you said just before. And again with global, that's presumably you just carry on at this point. It's ready made for you, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I've already started putting together a load of names and asking, you know, them about them and whether they want to go for that. And then I start sort of contacting some of the ones that I've got and saying, look, when could we do it? And we've already got probably 3 in the bag already. So one idea I came up with the other day is that James Taylor, the former English cricketer, would be a really good story, because my goodness me, he had his life interrupted, you know, blossoming England career, and then finds out he has that heart condition, and his cricketing career stopped like
turned
that.
Off. Yeah.
You know, so that's an amazing story, a horrible story, but also, you know, in terms of this particular subject matter, just an amazing story to tell. So we've got James booked in, I think, the week after next. Chatting to another couple of people. So we're beginning to build up sort of 4 or 5 people to go in, and then it's just a question of, it's hard sometimes because you'll get a name very late doors who's a really good name, but they can only do that particular day, and you've got other work on, so you just can't do it. So regrettably, sometimes you just have to accept, James, you'll lose a couple of good names, but you can't do everything, and it's not always is everybody available all at the same time. But while we've got the chance, we just want to keep doing them, and hopefully series 3 won't be that far away.
Well, I'm sure it's certainly going to feature on the chart. That's almost a certainty at this point, and hopefully we can grab you some of our international friends that we've gathered over time. Just have a look through some of the lists, because if you want to speak to anyone, I'm more than happy to connect you with them.
Thanks for your support, because you guys, I didn't know much about you, and then you start seeing these tweets and I thought, who are these guys? And I started looking down. So I've really appreciated all the support you've given the podcast over the last few weeks. It's been great.
Thank you. And I'm sure it'll continue. We'll send you all the bits and pieces that we've spoken about. I'll get the guys to send you your sort of full roster of stats through. But I have no doubt we'll keep supporting you. I personally really enjoyed the pod. I should say at this point, Simon Thomas, Life Interrupted is what you want to look, available from all good places that you get your podcast from.
Wherever you get your podcast.
There you go. Said with full voiceover voice. That was fantastic.
Yeah, full voice.
And season 3 is already in the works, so we're looking forward to that.
Thank you, mate.